Hey, common scientists, we're coming to you today with an awesome cast. We're pretty excited about it. It was recommended to us actually from one of our listeners and fans, Jordan Jackson. Shouts out, this one's for you. And it's on the First Amendment. So we're going to get into a bit of the nitty and gritty. We're going to talk a little bit about the First Amendment and where it comes from, a little bit about United States history for those of you who are outside of the United States, or for those of you who are in the United States and are oblivious, including myself to some of this, right? Like, I think United States government is over a lot of our heads, so we're going to get into just a little bit of that, but mostly focus on the First Amendment and some ideas surrounding it. So I'm going to kick it to Dre to start off with just a little bit of context where with the First Amendment, what is it a part of, and where did that kind of come from?
So the First Amendment is the first amendment of the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, which was essentially attached to the ratification of the Constitution, like directly after it was written. They knew, hey, there's also all of these other things that are really important. And a lot of the first 10 were in direct response to how America, the colonies, were treated by Great Britain. So we're only going to be covering the First Amendment today, and that protects religion, freedom of expression, otherwise known as speech and press, freedom of peaceful assembly, and then freedom to petition.
Yeah, awesome. So, Aiden, any initial thoughts or other context that you want to provide for our listeners about the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, or the Constitution?
I think so. Dre and I, before this cast, were talking about just how the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, there is much good in it, in that it has been the longest standing government charter and has produced a lot of opportunity for a lot of people. Uh, However, there's a lot of interpretation involved, and there's all sorts of uh, different ways that things have been interpreted in the past in a court of law, or just if you ask anybody on the street, uh, people take language in different ways. So I'm excited to dig into a little bit of that. But yeah, I think just that it is important to have some understanding of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and why we're all here.
Yeah, agreed. And I think we, as common scientists, exercise a lot of free speech, and I would be remiss to not recognize that that alone is a privilege. And I am grateful for the First Amendment for protecting my free speech thus far, and for allowing us to engage in these common science conversations and to have disagreements, to be wrong sometimes, to call out different sides of the fence politically, and also to remain safe. So I think it is an important topic and absolutely relates to common science in that way for sure.
Definitely. We're in an interesting period right now where there was quite a bit of civil unrest in the United States, still going on today, but especially last summer, when, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, the George Floyd trial, and there was a lot of, including in response to the Trump administration, there's been a lot of laying things out on the table, laying things bare, saying things that weren't always socially acceptable, politically acceptable. Some things for better, some things for the worse, perhaps. I'm mostly of the understanding or of the sentiment that kind of like, the truth will set us free. Like, lay all of our ideas, lay our thoughts on the table. If that's truly how you believe, then let your thoughts battle out on the marketplace of ideas. And I do believe at the end of the day, most of the bad ideas will lose out, like so many have in the history of our great nation, as well as many great nations before us. So definitely all for free speech. Definitely we do need at times take some time to reflect upon what the First Amendment has given us, the blessing that is freedom to petition, freedom to assembly, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech, which so many other countries do not have. Yes, most modern ones do, but a lot of the undeveloped ones, a lot of the non-democratic ones definitely do not. So definitely very grateful for that. And I think a lot of people who like, there's a lot of people on the side that the United States, like kind of judging the United States and using their freedom of speech to attack some of our flaws. And I think and then there's a whole another side of the spectrum that is really upset. They're like, because it's kind of the people who are like, well, then leave. Like, if you hate our country so much, it's like, what do you mean you're not standing for the flag? What do you mean you hate America? You hate this part of America? And I understand that because we are raised to be nationalistic and to have a great pride in our country, and we should to some extent. There are a lot of amazing things about our country, including the Bill of Rights. But I think there is definitely kind of a disconnect there, and definitely a clash where people were using we're using our First Amendment right to criticize the government that gave us the freedom of speech. So it is a really beautiful, complex dynamic.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it will be helpful to, outside of kind of naming the general protections listed in the First Amendment, I think just reading it would be helpful for myself and probably for our listeners and viewers. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So I think there's a lot there. There's a lot of power to that statement. And yeah, you're right, Dre. It is this beautiful, challenging relationship, because I am a person who would say that I mostly hate America. And I am super grateful for my First Amendment rights.
Mm-hmm.
And coming into this cast, we were just chatting like, oh, are you guys excited for the cast? I was like, oh man, I'm nervous about it because I have a lot of ambivalent feelings. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, that means like feeling in ways that kind of don't always align. And so, yeah, I mean, in a conversation about the First Amendment, I am pretty certain I'll contradict myself or like say something that goes back on something I said, because I haven't found like an aligned clarity yet, I don't think. Mm-hmm. But that's part of common science too.
Yeah, I hear you, Lauren, as well, in terms of the conflicting thoughts regarding the First Amendment. I gotta say, first and foremost, that freedom of speech is quite unique in human history for a society, and like I think it is something that should be cherished and is incredibly valuable. But as Dre alluded to, in terms of these outsiders potentially manipulating the U.S. because of our free speech, that's one challenge to it for sure. Another one in the related to what you were talking about as far as the civil unrest would be how corporations in particular have kind of become these arbiters of free speech, and like whether it be Twitter, YouTube, Google, the umbrella company of YouTube, but like these companies make decisions on what is allowed on these platforms and what's not. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's something that I would like to tease through in this conversation somewhat as well, is like what what does free speech look like on those platforms? Is it possible? But yeah, I mean, I am immensely thankful for the First Amendment right, and that we can criticize the state, and we can try to find more truth as a state.
Yeah.
But I think there are digital technology in particular has presented significant challenges to the concept of free speech being a sustainable one for society.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd love to get into that more.
Mm-hmm.
I also, like, while we're just thinking about high level context, I think too, there's a lot of areas that the United States does not practice the First Amendment as well as it could. And I think there are a plethora of reasons for that, right? It's super complicated. And there is this, because of the way our government is built, there is companies that are super powerful, and then states have quite a bit of power, and then cities have quite a bit of power. And one example that comes to mind, moving to the Minneapolis school district, which is in the Twin Cities area, Minneapolis, St. Paul being the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and becoming a little bit familiar with some of the challenges in the school because I have applied to be a substitute teacher and found out that this year school is starting later to honor a holiday that's taking place right now that I can't think of, which is kind of sad. But needless to say, it's like a non-majority holiday, which is in and of itself like a bit of a problem. That's the way I think about it. But it was recommended by a teacher that I am close to that we should just move to a model similar to how some schools in New York practice, where like pretty much every major holiday, like we hear of Christmas being like off for students, is off for also like the Hmong people and people who practice Jewish culture or faith and so on and so forth. And I know that that's not practiced very well. And I mean, there just is a plethora of examples, I think, of whether it's social media or religion in schools or other areas where the First Amendment maybe isn't being honored as well as it could be. And there's a lot of power at play in those conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree. And there's a huge issue with and a huge conversation to be had with like majority and minority, because at some point the majority, you can't really make a society for everybody in every certain instant. Of course, going back to the city on the hill, we can try our best to represent everybody, give everybody a voice, give everybody an opportunity, and I think we're far from where we could be.
Mm-hmm.
And it is an honorable ideal, but at the end of the day, we really can't. And I think to your point, yes, we could make. It's not impossible to better incorporate other cultures and other religions specifically into the public school system.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, when it comes to things like freedom of religion or religious issues, so freedom of religion has two clauses, right? The Establishment Clause, which essentially says that the government can't establish a religion, so it's like the separation of church and state. That is like freedom from religion.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the Expression Clause, which is the freedom of religion is for you to practice. The government can't say, hey, you can't practice this religion,
Mm-hmm.
right? Two really, really important parts. And public schools are government funded, right? So they do have to take that into consideration to some extent. And of course, we've seen prayer be knocked out of public schools. We've seen the God bless. What am I thinking of right now?
Oh, the pledge.
Yeah, the Pledge of Allegiance. We've seen that because that mentions God. We've seen a lot of things knocked out of the public school system, at least partially due to
pieces of it. They don't say the under God part.
Right. So at least pieces of it, parts of it, etc. Because of any sort of reference to religion or God. And I think it is really a struggle to represent all peoples, and I just wonder, like, what would that look like? Would that look like some kids being out of school for a month to do this while other ones are in the school? Because at the end of the day, there's two things that have set precedent for how the Constitution slash Bill of Rights slash First Amendment is treated, interpreted, or whether it is kind of listened to or not. And those two big ideas are public interest and national interest. And when it comes to both national and public interest, that could possibly be the idea of like incorporating all of these different stagnated, or not stagnated, but what's the word I'm looking for? Like separated or staggered breaks for different cultures. That could be so detrimental to the public interest that public schools are trying to inculcate that it just, unfortunately, it isn't something that we can institutionalize. But then, do we punish people for taking their,
Right.
if they're like, hey, this is this important to me, I'm going to take my student out for 2 weeks, even though it's not Christmas break or whatever it is, it's not Easter, Good Friday, etc. I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah. So put a pin in it. Hand it off to policymakers, or something, or you, common scientists. What about free speech in media?
So I think that on the topic of free speech in media, I mean, media is a broad category in and of itself, and I think that the medium itself can perhaps govern some of the conversation, like what you were talking about. Like, do you publish or do you punish because of this, or do you not? Like, I think that online discourse in particular is challenging because you can't. It's hard to communicate nuance, like in the form of a tweet in 140 characters. And we talked about how the Constitution can be interpreted in different ways, and these tweets can be interpreted in drastically different ways. And so it's such a dance, and I don't know what the answer is, but like, are lifetime bans of certain people part of the answer? Again, I don't know. Do you guys have any takes on that in particular?
What was the question?
Like the banning of people from these platforms, or deplatforming?
Oh, deplatforming and cancel culture and stuff like that. It's really difficult because even as I was researching and seeing some of the landmark cases with freedom of speech, like Hess v. Indiana, etc., some of these interpretations that the Supreme Court justice, even though I can reflect back on them, it's like, oh, I think that was the right decision. I think, yes. So, for example, Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969 was where there was a KKK member that said there might have to be some revengeance taken. And there was this court case saying, like, hey, this is a threat. He shouldn't be able to say this, right? He's infringing upon peace and our ability to, like, pursue our own happiness because he's inciting violence. And in the Brandenburg case, and there ended up being a Brandenburg test, which has two parts, where in order for this speech to be illegal and advocating, like, violence, it has to, number one, be directed and inciting and producing imminent lawless action. So imminent means soon, like it has to be almost right away. And then two, it has to be likely to incite or produce that action. So it has to be inciting, clearly saying it's going to happen soon. And number two, we have to agree that, okay, this is probably going to get that actually done. It can't just be some idle, random, nobody's going to listen. And in this case, since there was no timetable, they were like, yeah, he kind of alluded to some sort of violence, but there wasn't a timetable, there wasn't a plan, so therefore this is protected under the First Amendment. And that goes into, I mean, we've seen that with Trump at his rally before, and I know people are calling for some legal actions with that, when he had that big rally, and he said a couple of things that might be interpreted as, hey, go storm the Capitol, bust people up, rip them out of there, and do all these things, right? Was that January 6, 2021, right?
Mhm.
Just earlier this year. And people are really, some people are saying, hey, that's just First Amendment rights. Like, he's not saying anything. And other people are saying, no, this is clearly advocating like imminent illegal activity. So when it comes to social media, which these are, I think all of them are generally like they're private companies, right? Like they're owned by just CEOs and stuff. So this is not a governmental thing. This is not something that's under the federal or state law of the First Amendment. So they can do whatever they like to do. So really, what's being under attack is not the actual First Amendment or freedom of speech. It's the spirit of the freedom of speech.
Yeah, so I just want to say they are governed by federal law, but the reason why deplatforming, so the analogy I heard is if you're in the room with somebody and somebody is causing a ruckus, basically, like you can ask them to leave.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, so that's like kind of the idea is that you're not prohibiting their speech. They can take that speech elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
but you're taking them off of this platform.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the idea I have understood, or how I've understood it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for clarifying. But legally, these companies, they're not doing anything illegal, right? Because they're not, like you said, they're not prohibiting, they're not infringing upon anybody's freedom of speech. They're just saying, hey, you can do that, not here.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's still like the point is they're attacking the spirit of the freedom of
Right.
speech, and that's where like can the government come in and be like no, because a lot of these companies and a lot of these founders, whether they're liberal or leaning left, a lot of them are taking kind of left-leaning actions and really focusing on this alt-right and these extreme radical right people and deplatforming them. At least that's the general idea. I don't know what the stats are, but these are just the narratives that I hear spun by certain outlets. And that's why and I think even if it was equal, people would still be upset about it, and they should, I think. But are they actually doing anything wrong by deplatforming people? It's their company.
Right. Yeah, I don't think so by law. The challenging thing about it, in my opinion, is that some of these platforms dominate the way that people communicate. Like, Twitter is not just Twitter. Like, Twitter exists outside of a company for many people. Like, for many people, Twitter is their lifeline, their window to community and communication. And because of that, I find the issue even more perplexing because Twitter is not just Google is not just a company, right? Google is a verb, and Google is, and the same goes for Twitter, and maybe not so much for Instagram, but maybe for Facebook. People view it, I would say, almost as much more so as a community, as their main outlet or engagement route, as their window into the world. And those, I think, are all super problematic for a lot of different reasons outside of the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's when it's super challenging because these companies are larger than companies. They're larger than life. They're larger than government. Some of these companies could buy countries. So
yeah, no question.
I think it's really perplexing, super challenging.
Yeah, it is. It is super challenging. Here's another tidbit that if people are not aware, so less social media related, but more traditional media related. So Jeff Bezos, we all know who he is, right? The world's richest man. At least he's been on and off with, I think, Elon recently. But he bought the Washington Post in 2013 and turned the corner. So the Washington Post is a storied American newspaper, and they put a lot of investment into digital and social media advertising. So what kind of Amazon does well, right? And so he carried him and his, I mean, obviously team, because he's only one man, definitely a rich man, but there was a lot of investment in like social media, digital advertising, and then technology as well. So one of their leading revenue sources now is actually a software that they sell, which I think is just, I had no idea. But this company that is a newspaper primarily in terms of its like public facing appearance, like has been, trying to remember which years exactly it is, but it turned a profit for 4 years running, and it had been not doing so before for a long time before Jeff Bezos bought it. So it's, and then there's like also, I mean, so that's one side of it, and then there's the other side of it is that some of these employees are organizing to like try to negotiate for higher pay and are having difficulty with negotiating with like the management at the Washington Post, which is kind of a theme in Jeff Bezos's dealings with Amazon. But yeah, it's just this kind of intertwining of corporate interests and traditional newspapers that yeah, I think again similar to the social media challenges the concept of free speech for sure.
Because I'm struggling with the line of thought.
Like, I mean, I think about, we talk about the First Amendment, right? And how that governs the federal government. And we do talk about how the federal government does, their regulations do apply to these companies, yet I mean, showing somebody the door on Twitter, like you said, it's this outlet that is so just pervasive in our society. Like, I mean, there's just so many different avenues where these companies have so much control over our media and discourse that, I mean, you got to think it's got to affect, I mean, discourse in general. But it's just, yeah, something that I came across in my reading. And again, I don't know what the answer is, because newspapers, the business model got pretty disrupted. But I think that like more independent journalism is always good for a free society.
I agree. So, staying on the idea of either deplatforming or cancel culture, if you guys had to give an answer, what do you think? Are these cases of people being deplatformed, is this in general the right, like, an acceptable direction? Or is this like, no, we should condemn this as the public?
I would say, in general, it is okay. And my reasoning behind that is that I don't think deplatforming is the problem in and of itself. I think the problem is coming from somewhere else. And I would probably argue that the problem is like living in a society where truth is fractured. So because we live in a society where, due to the internet, due to search engines, and I mean Google and other, like, well, any search engine, due to the way that it's built and the way that it's built for you to see what is popular versus what is truth, we live in a world where like different people can live in different realities, right? If you are far left or far right, or if you are, I mean, a super strong vegan versus like a hunter, right? Like whatever it is, your reality can be very different than someone else's. And I think that, in my mind, is the problem. And when we live in a society where that is the case, of course there's going to be discourse that is really misunderstood and or understood depending on the argument. And of course there's going to be scenarios where people are asked to leave the room, so to speak, using Aidan, your same analogy. And if in fact Twitter is your reality and your community, like, I think you have a problem. I don't think Twitter has a problem. So that's my...
So you would advocate for more people to either, reduce use of Twitter or not entirely?
No, not necessarily. Just that, like, if your identity or your tie to reality comes from Twitter or Facebook or like anything else that's a search engine, basically, I would say, like, so much so that you feel deeply offended when someone gets asked to leave the room.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you get to the point where that feels deeply offending, like, there aren't enough rooms in your world. Like, go find another room. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, and if Twitter and Facebook and whatever are your main rooms, like, that's what I'm saying, that then you need to check yourself. Like, so I don't think you need to necessarily just decrease your media consumption as long as you have other rooms available, as long as you understand Twitter is not my reality, as long as you know that, like, Facebook is a search engine, I've got to make sure to check in with my friends over beers, as long as you are understanding that, like, the reality you see in the Internet of Things could be different than someone else's. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think for sure. It comes a lot of it. Like, so what I hear is that we need to, awareness is the first step in acknowledging that acknowledging that these biases exist in what we are presented from a search engine, and acknowledging that these might in fact just straight up be different than somebody else's. Like, that knowledge in and of itself can help us, or like we should take that and think more critically about the media we consume.
Yeah, I think that's one facet of what I was trying to wrap around. It's a challenging issue.
One pushback I have on that is I do agree with a lot of your sentiment on that. The issue is that the room is the world. That's the issue with these social. They've gotten so big. They've grown beyond what any of us would have imagined, and they've hacked into a particular part of our psychology as human beings. It's like the best and the worst creation in human history in some regards. And I just think that because, like your point about how these companies make enough money to buy countries, they also have enough people to be like the third biggest country in the world, second biggest country in the world. Billions and billions of people are on these platforms. So when you're deplatforming somebody from Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc., in a sense, you're deplatforming them from the world. Because this is what the world is now. The world is electronic. The world is digital. The world is more connected than ever. So yes, I can walk outside and start talking to people. That's not how the world works anymore.
Yeah, I think one approach. So I backing up to, what was the name of the test that
The Brandenburg test?
The Brandenburg test. Like, I appreciate tests such as that for maybe determining whether or not content might be removed. I also think that one thing I have appreciated is some of the media companies, like YouTube in particular, whenever there's a video that is on climate change, now they present the Wikipedia climate change, like from a reputable source, like immediately below the video. Whether or not they know, because I mean, there's just so much video on YouTube, right? Whether or not they know what the content itself might be advocating, they still present. In addition, here is what like we as YouTube believe to be true. I think that is
Helpful.
a helpful strategy to still permit freedom of speech and permit that connection that I think is critical in the digital age, and then also try to alleviate some of the concerns of what we talked about, the fracturing of truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that helps, as I think both of you touched on now, like with these echo chambers where you're getting into these social rabbit holes and you're just hearing the same things over, and all of a sudden some of these things that are kind of out there ideas seem very normal, very true. But if you have these companies, and we hope that they're not acting as some sort of a tyrant, but it's like some sort of social group, community, like the community of YouTube, the community of Facebook, whether that just be the company, the corporate, or some sort of larger, expansive group, is contributing to, like, this might be true, but also this many people, or like there's this evidence for this other idea as well. And that, I think one of the issues with something like that, and maybe I'm just kind of tangenting off of what you were saying, one of the issues with that is a lot of those things are coming with conspiracies, and obviously now we see it a lot with vaccines. And while I tend to agree with them, just because I in the scientific community tend to agree with a lot of these things, doesn't mean we're right. We've been wrong before. So then I would feel like you would have to apply that to almost all of posts and videos. Like you would have to try to find, maybe once they get to a certain level, like views or something, right? Certain impact or outreach, whatever they call it, you'd have to attach some sort of contradictory argument to these things in order to try to help people battle the ideas, like I said, on the marketplace.
Yeah. I think it's a challenge for sure. What was the movie we watched, Death to 2020, Lauren?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is it?
Death to 2020. Did you watch it?
No, never heard of it.
Oh, it's a mockumentary. So
Love 'em.
it's a comedy that is of the documentary sort, and it's about everything that happened in 2020 with a comedic spin, and you might need to mentally prepare yourself because 2020 is still recent, and there was a lot that happened in 2020. There is one scene where they just demonstrate some of the like alternate reality that other people see, like just everyone seems to be living in because of these platforms. And that, I mean, just seeing it in a like live action kind of film where it's in an interview form and you see the person who is like spouting things that just, I mean, do not jive whatsoever with my own world understanding of the world. It just, it baffles the mind and makes me, I mean, just think about how important these sorts of conversations are and issues are. As Lauren, you said earlier too, grabbing beers and talking it out with people, I think is super valuable. I mean, there's been a number of times when you guys have called me on my crap and vice versa, but yeah, it's all important stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dre, though, that the issue is that that the room is the world, you said. And those sorts of comments or sentiments, which I think are true, most of what you said, nearly everything that you said, I totally agree with. Which means, like, you're right, you can't always just find another room, because if the room is the world, like, none of your rooms are going to compare at all, not even a little, to what today looks like. Which is where some of my more radical ideas probably come, because then I'm like, okay, well, I so fundamentally think that that's the problem, that like that maybe we shouldn't have the room. Like, maybe Twitter should have limits. Maybe we are not meant to be this hyper connected, because it's like it's fake connection. Like, maybe that is the problem, and maybe we need to aggressively look in a whole different direction. And I think people are really scared to talk like that, because a lot of the human connection that we feel and a lot of the approval that we seek today comes from social media, right? The likes are what affirm my outfit, the whatever it is. And I would argue that a lot of that isn't real. Like, a lot of that is
It's a sugar
self-inflating, right? It's a small, a small high that lasts only momentarily, and it's fleeting, and then it's gone. And yeah, I think that's the problem. And I so fundamentally believe that, then I'm like, okay, well, then maybe Twitter's the problem. Like, maybe Facebook shouldn't exist. Maybe we need to aggressively and drastically reconsider what connection looks like today, and if we want global connection, what that might look like.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating you bring that up, because I think it was Cal Newport, but don't quote me on this, because I think that it was either him or another computer science guy who was discussing about the birth of the internet and how websites grew in popularity originally, and how it grew from peer-to-peer sharing. So somebody might email one person a link, and then somebody might email you the link, and it was more
organic,
yeah, compared to what I would view as like this like and virality that is fueled in a lot of these social media platforms. His take on it, whoever I was reading, was that these social media platforms are more fragile than we think, in that, yes, they're enormously powerful in terms of their amount of financial resources, and in terms of like their variety of apps and things. Yet, like in the example of Twitter, if everybody deleted the app from their phone tomorrow, like that would, I mean, what would Twitter be then? And like, if more people decide to seek more meaningful connection, more perhaps in-person connection, individual connection, as opposed to the crowds, like, I think that there could be some organic regulation of the room, as you said, as opposed to maybe political ones.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if more people start to realize, or start to consider that it's taking more than it's adding,
right,
or taking too much.
Right. Yeah, I think too about what it like, when are instances that I want to have the freedom of speech? And I would say primarily, like, when I want to engage in meaningful conversation, or maybe in conversation that I believe strongly in, which I'm hoping would also be meaningful conversation. I don't see that much meaningful conversation on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. And so that's the other piece of it that I think is a little bit fascinating, because, like, if the goal is meaningful conversation, do we care if anyone gets booted off Twitter? Like, maybe not. But the other piece that is, and even, like, complicates things even further, is that the ability to rally and the ability to peacefully rally and to gather a lot of people to do that also is facilitated by many of these platforms in a way that no other connection or connector can. And like you said, Dre, if your stage is the world, or if your stage is the US or a state, like, I don't have access to every state email. I couldn't email everyone and say, like, hey, I'm having a peaceful rally on this thing that I believe in. And so I think that too complicates things, where, like, yeah, maybe everyone should have access to Twitter, to whatever, and in that way maybe it's wrong that anyone get kicked off, because you've got to know, like, when the people are mobilizing. And I would never have thought of that until I did volunteer work in Uganda, and every now and then the government just shuts off the internet because the people are getting too organized. And if you shut off the internet and everyone can no longer communicate, everyone goes home, which is also scary. And then the only other problem that I want to throw into the mix is the issue of trust and mistrust in conversation. I recently heard a functional definition for mistrust from Brené Brown, and it is this: when what is important to me isn't safe with you in this situation, or really in any situation. I'll read that again. When what is important to me isn't safe with you in this situation, or really in any situation. And I think in a society that has fractured truth and that has a lot of mistrust, also what's happening on these platforms, like, probably isn't valuable, or as valuable as we might think it is. I told you guys, ambivalent. I have a lot of
lots of different thoughts, lots of conflicting thoughts. Here's a quote by Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist during the Civil War, the American Civil War specifically. Mankind are not held together by lies. Trust is the foundation of society. Where there is no truth, there can be no trust. Where there is no trust, there can be no society.
So, when what's important to me isn't safe with you in this situation or in any situation, we lose touch with society. That's, like, a functional definition based on that quote and this. And it's like, okay, so maybe, like, social media is actually breaking society, which is not really a First Amendment question, but...
And also not so comforting, but... well,
I'm rather unconvinced that social media is breaking society. I think that social media is one of the clearest signs of an apotheosis of humanity. It is who we are. And yes, there are some humans who are writing algorithms that are hacking our psychology, but all in all, it's a very human site. platform, etc. And I think my issue with trying to end social media is, speaking of Frederick Douglass, it would have been a lot easier to free the slaves if there was social media, if news could be disseminated by a small group of people that easily. It'd be a lot easier to bring awareness to any issue. And that's part of the reason why social media is depressing, is because so many of us are seeing how broken we are as a species. And that is not necessarily social media's fault, that's just us. And you guys are talking a lot about truth and mistrust. Whether social media is sowing the seeds of distrust or merely just reaping the seeds that the government has been sowing for generations. I think there's an argument there. And I'm going to transition this into somebody I want to talk about. Are you guys familiar with Julian Assange?
Just from, yeah.
Just things,
I've heard
social media.
I've heard of him, and yeah.
So Julian Assange founded WikiLeaks in 2006.
I'm familiar with WikiLeaks.
Okay, WikiLeaks gained global notoriety in 2010 with the release of when Chelsea Manning released all of these, like 750,000 documents, reports from the United States government. Chelsea Manning was in the U.S. military. Then she became some sort of high security person. She had access to all this information, and she doxed it. In there, two of the important documents are the Iraq war logs and the Afghanistan war diaries. And in these, they have very clear reported factual documentation of war crimes that the U.S. was committing in the Middle East. So in 2010, so obviously Chelsea Manning's like, hey, this is not good. It's not the Baghdad airstrikes where we had Apache helicopters going through and shooting civilians, in which two journalists from the Reuters International Journalist Company died. That's an issue. That's a war crime. That's an atrocity. And Chelsea Manning had a conscience and risked her life to dox that and send it to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and then he risked his life. Though I'm sure he had some understanding that he was at risk, but that should be freedom of press, right? He didn't dox it. He just has information. He should have the freedom of speech, the freedom of press to print it or to put it out there. So Chelsea Manning, for this, which many consider her an American hero, right? She's fighting war crimes. It doesn't, like, again, we talked about this, tribalism. It doesn't matter if it's us who's doing it. Wrong is wrong, right is right. So some consider her a hero. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Then Barack Obama, 7 years into her prison sentence, Barack Obama commuted her conviction, and therefore, I think it's like still on her record and everything, but she only had to serve 7 years. Shortly after that doxing, that whistleblowing.
What do you mean when you say doxing?
Doxing, like revealing private information or secret or classified information to the public. So after that whistleblowing, shortly after that, the U.S. government charged or started a criminal investigation into Julian Assange. So then he had to, obviously, he's an Australian guy, but I think he lived here. He had to move. He was in Sweden for a time, where he eventually got accused of sexual misconduct, which some people, of course, believe that he did it. Many believe that it was simply a ruse to get him extradited back to America. So then he fled Sweden. He was in Great Britain. They essentially were, I think, collaborating with Sweden. But instead of going back to Sweden, where he would just get extradited, instead of getting extradited to Sweden, where he get extradited to the U.S. to serve his penalty for, I think essentially they were charging him, they essentially want to charge him with espionage, so essentially like spying, releasing military secrets that would threaten national security. And so then he found asylum in Ecuador for a couple years. Eventually the Ecuadorian embassy, whoever, police force, government was like, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And then he was arrested. And now for the last couple years, he's been in prison, essentially just kind of rotting away in there. And there's a huge public outcry in many circles. A lot of press companies, freedom of speech supporters are saying this is a direct attack against the First Amendment of the United States. We cannot incriminate this guy. But of course, the government is saying he took part in releasing these secrets, and even though they were military crimes, that's still classified for a reason, right? It's 750,000 documents. That's could threaten our national security. So this is a huge argument, obviously, first and foremost, or main thing first and foremost, for the First Amendment, freedom of speech and press. But then also, this is where, going back to, there's this idea of like natural interest where the government can decide, hey, this is such a big risk to our national security, we can just trample over these rights for the greater good. And then there's also public interest. So many are claiming we pay taxes to our government. We vote for our politicians. We send our boys, our children, everybody into the military. We have the right to know what's happening there. So I am of the belief, free Julian Assange. He didn't do anything wrong. And we should have that information. And I should know that my tax dollars are going to a government that commits war crimes in my name. Your guys' thoughts on that?
I would say that I don't know enough about the situation. I mean, I think that all that it reminds me of is that reality is gray and there's so many complexities. Like, okay, I do agree that we should know and thus be able to hold government accountable that war crimes occur. Yet I also understand that there is some importance to secrets, like to in the name of national security. And I think of, I mean, for one, like how to make a nuclear bomb, or like, I don't know exactly, but like there's people, there is animosity that exists in the world, and like I mean, it's a conflicting. I guess I can see two sides to it. I mean, obviously, because there are two sides to it. On the one hand, like I think that I can't think of any like more concrete examples as far as the national security side of things. But my gut reaction is that there is some information that needs to know for our society to be more, provide more of a safe environment for more people. But I mean, I do, yeah, agree that like there should be more freedom of information. It's just like I don't know enough about the situation to decide, I guess, which one way or the other, how I would lie. In the case of Edward Snowden, like he did something similar where he released a whole bunch of documents and then now is living in Russia. And I'm a little bit more familiar with his story. And in his case, I would say, I mean, yeah, definitely we should welcome him back to the States and give him the protection to criticize and reveal some dirty secrets, so we can, like you said, have this war of ideas, or truth seeking, as I've called it in the past. But yeah, so I guess I just don't know enough about it, but I do see the two sides for sure. What about you, Lauren?
definitely, I mean, I see both sides also to the issue. I think in the specific case that you presented, without knowing a lot more information, I would probably disagree with your sentiment, Dre, and I don't know enough information. And I think for probably two main reasons, which one kind of isn't a reason because it's not the reality we live in, but like, one, I would say if war crimes are happening, and they are, and they have, and they do, someone should be held accountable for that. And it should not be the job of so-and-so to leak it in order for our government to be held to like a moral standard that we've decided on. Right? But that's not the reality we live in, unfortunately. So that would be like one reason. And then the other piece of it for me that I can't really detach my personal experience and feelings associated to or from the scenario, but is that my dad served in Iraq, and there was a hypothetical instance where information was leaked while he was gone, hypothetically, and friends' lives were lost. And I just remember, hypothetically, I could imagine hearing about that and just being like rocked that the taxpayers' dollars, who you are risking your life for and away from your family for and missing birthdays for, like, didn't also protect your friends. Like, that someone decided they were above the decisions that had been made to leak however many documents that like may or may not have costed lives. And like, I can't detach that story to like an answer for you. And yeah, because of that, I think I would disagree. But like, yeah, of course war crimes should be tried. And like, if those two documents were the only documents, like, of course that person should be liberated. And maybe there's an argument where like it was a quick upload and she feared her life and whatever else, and so she could only leak the X number. I mean, I could conceive of an argument where she maybe could still be like set free. It's a challenging issue.
Yeah, it definitely is. There's one. Thank you for sharing the hypothetical story, because I think it's a revealing hypothetical, in the context of this question and conversation. There's a principle in IT where you give people the lowest permissions, users. You give users the lowest permissions possible that they can still achieve their job or complete their tasks. But also, you don't give them so many permissions that it becomes a risk. Where, like, so say you give somebody administrator permissions where they can make changes to a company database or whatever else, and they don't actually need them. Well, that's one more point of entry, one more like location where people could get into the system and cause damage to the system. And so the connection I'm now drawing to this question and conversation that we're talking about is like, I think leaking can be valuable in instances. I hope that there can be some, like, perhaps they put on, again, I don't know enough about the Julian Assange situation specifically, but I think like putting on this like hat of, oh, what is the minimum amount of information or like privileges I can release to the public that reveal the war crimes or other like atrocities,
Right.
yet do not put like people at risk, whether they be service members or otherwise. Like, I think like perhaps that, again, that's, I guess, some form of self-censoring, which loops back into the whole First Amendment thing. But I think that like perhaps, yeah, like trying to figuring out what is enough information to release to expose the wrong so that they may be rectified without also exposing too much that there might be damage caused to people. Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question, and
Yeah, and maybe you need to release X number of documents for people to really realize, like, holy crap, those 2 documents had to have been real because they're accompanied by these other 70 whatever it was.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was 750,000, but that was Chelsea Manning's doxing, not what Julian Assange actually posted on WikiLeaks. Another thing to remember is that Chelsea Manning was sentenced to 35 years, then commuted after 7 years, so Chelsea Manning is free.
Oh yeah.
But they're still trying to convict Julian Assange when he wasn't the one who got the information from them, right? Chelsea Manning was the one who stole it.
Oh, he just put it on
he just, hey, I have this information that I think it's in the public's best interest. This is for the good of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, that's a helpful distinguisher and reminder. And in like with that reminder and that context, I think, yeah, that seems like a little crazy. That if he's not, like, he wasn't the responsible person in the first place, it seems a little crazy. And I think too, in the context of like whistleblowing, and I mean, people have to be protected. I think of Karen Silkwood and the plutonium that was being used at a big plant. Now I'm trying to recall something that I did no research on Common Scientist for this cast, but she was just an iconic character because she figured out that this plutonium was causing damage, like health damage, to workers at a plant, and came forward and whistle blew, and there was a big case, Karen Silkwood versus, I don't recall the name of the company, but she ended up winning and saving a lot of people's lives because of it. So there's got to be a balance between the whistleblowers being protected, absolutely, and information being protected, but generally there too, like, that is also within the interest of the general public. Well, Common Scientists, the First Amendment, it's kind of nuts. Thank God we're protected. But there are some twists and turns. There are a lot of questions. And there are a lot of areas for you to do some more common science research to figure out what rights are you thankful for? What First Amendment rights can you practice today and tomorrow? And maybe how can you tap into more truth and more connection in your daily life?
Hey, Common Scientists. Hope you enjoyed the cast. Thanks for investing in common science. We hope it brought as much value to you as it did to us.
To learn more, smash the subscribe button and visit our website, commonscientists.com, where you can read our blog, join our email newsletter, and follow us on social media.
Finally, if you like what we have to say, you can absolutely support us on Patreon. We can always use more support. You can navigate there also from our website, commonscientists.com, Common Scientists with an S, so that we can continue cultivating a community of common scientists.